The path from the village to the mill crossed through the Wolfwood. Everyone knew the rule: never travel that road alone after dusk, especially not during the winter of the long moon. In 1643, in the French parish of Saint-Hippolyte, a miller named Pierre Le Basque failed to follow that rule. His body was found 3 days later, partially consumed, with tracks around the scene that the local magistrate described in the official record as resembling a wolf's, but larger, distorted as if the beast had walked on 2 legs before dropping to 4. The villagers did not whisper the word werewolf. They screamed it. Now consider this. For centuries, the werewolf myth has been presented as a textbook case of pre-scientific superstition. Peasants, the story goes, lived in terror of a thing that never existed. They burned suspected werewolves at the stake. They performed exorcisms on men who grew hair in the wrong seasons. The modern mind looks back and sees only ignorance, a fear of the dark given claws and fur. But that interpretation is itself a comfortable myth. The real story is something far more unsettling, because it suggests that the terror of the werewolf was never entirely imagined. It was a warning, encoded in folklore, about a biological reality that the peasants could not name but could see. The first crack in the sanitized version of history appears when you examine the geographical distribution of werewolf trials. They cluster in specific regions of France, Germany, and the Baltic states, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries. They do not cluster in England, where wolf populations had been hunted to functional extinction by the 1500s. They cluster where wolves still lived. This is not a trivial correlation. The peasants who testified in werewolf trials did not describe a generic monster. They described something that moved like a wolf, attacked like a wolf, and left tracks that, under the light of a winter moon, looked almost exactly like a wolf's. The difference was the size of the paw, the angle of the stride, and the unsettling detail that some prints appeared to show a partial human gait before the animal dropped into a hunting sprint. That detail, the half-human footprint before the wolf's sprint, is the kind of clue that rewires how you see the past. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden layers in history, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the moments that the textbooks leave as footnotes. And let me know in the comments. If you found a track like that outside your village, would your first thought be monster or man? So what was it? The answer requires us to reconsider a creature that modern biology has largely forgotten. Across medieval Europe, a rare but documented condition existed in which wolves, driven by starvation or disease, lost their fear of humans. These were not the wolves of fairy tales. They were real animals weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, with jaws capable of crushing a femur in a single bite. When a healthy wolf encounters a human, it flees. When a rabid wolf encounters a human, it attacks without warning and without the typical prey-stalking behavior. The peasant who survived such an attack would report that the beast did not act like an ordinary wolf. It acted possessed. It did not run. It did not flinch at fire or noise. It locked its jaws and had to be pried off with iron bars. Here's where the trail deepens. Rabies produces a constellation of symptoms that, to an observer in the year 1550, would map perfectly onto the werewolf myth. The infected animal becomes aggressive, disoriented, and prone to attacking without provocation. It froths at the mouth, its gait becomes uncoordinated, almost as if the creature is struggling to control its own limbs. In humans infected with rabies, the disease produces a condition called hydrophobia, an uncontrollable fear of water that leads to violent spasms when the victim tries to drink. The medieval mind, confronted with a man who howled at the moon, snapped at his caretakers, and convulsed at the sight of water, had only one framework to explain it. The man had been turned into a wolf. Now pivot to a second layer of evidence that most modern accounts ignore. The werewolf trials of the Jura region, spanning what is now eastern France and western Switzerland, reached their peak between 1570 and 1610. The accused were almost always men who lived on the periphery of the community. They were shepherds, hunters, charcoal burners, men who spent months alone in the forest and returned with the smell of pine and blood on their clothes. These men frequently confessed under torture, but some of their confessions contained details that no torturer could have planted. Specific locations where wolves had killed livestock, descriptions of dens that were later verified by hunters. The question is not whether these men were werewolves. The question is why they believed they were. The answer lies in a fungus called ergot, a parasitic growth that infects rye grain in wet, cold harvest seasons. Ergot poisoning produces a condition known as ergotism, which has 2 forms. The convulsive form causes violent muscle spasms, hallucinations, and a sensation of crawling or biting under the skin. The gangrenous form constricts blood vessels, leading to the blackening and eventual loss of fingers, toes, and in severe cases, entire limbs. The symptoms of ergotism were documented in medieval medical texts, but the connection to bread was not understood until the late 17th century. The historian Mary Kilbourne Matassian, whose 1989 analysis mapped the correlation between rye-dependent regions and outbreaks of mass hysteria, showed that the werewolf panics of the 16th century occurred in precisely the same areas where the climate had been cold and wet for 3 consecutive harvests. Think about that. The same bread that gave you life could also give you visions of wolves crawling under your skin. This is the kind of investigation that demands a community, people willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If that is you, subscribe, and in the comments tell me, what other historical mysteries might dissolve when we look at the weather? Drop your most surprising connection. Now consider what it would mean to be a peasant in the Jura Mountains in 1582. You eat bread made from rye that has been stored in a damp cellar for 6 months. You begin to feel a crawling sensation under your skin, as if something is moving just beneath the surface. Your hands twitch uncontrollably. At night, you dream of wolves. When you wake, you cannot tell if the howling you hear is inside your head or outside your door. Someone in the village finds a dead sheep, torn apart in a pattern that looks almost human. The local priest speaks of the loup-garou, the werewolf who has made a pact with the devil. A neighbor accuses you of being the beast. You protest your innocence, but even you are not sure anymore. The hallucinations have become so vivid that you have seen your own hands transform into claws in the firelight. This is the paradox that the modern explanation cannot resolve. The peasants were not stupid. They understood the difference between a wolf and a man. They hunted wolves. They wore wolf pelts. They knew the sound of a wolf's howl and the shape of a wolf's track with a precision that most modern naturalists would envy. Their terror did not come from ignorance. It came from the fact that what they saw did not fit the categories they had. They saw a wolf that moved like a man and a man that attacked like a wolf. They saw the same disease that killed their cattle appearing in their neighbors. They saw the same madness that drove a dog to foam at the mouth appearing in a child. And they called it what any culture would call something that violates the boundary between the animal and the human. They called it a curse. The year 1764 in the Gévaudan region of south-central France provides the clearest evidence that the werewolf was never entirely supernatural. Over 3 years, the beast of Gévaudan killed more than 100 people, primarily women and children, in a series of attacks that followed a pattern no ordinary wolf would sustain. The beast attacked during daylight. It targeted the throat and upper chest. It showed no fear of human settlements. The King of France sent professional wolf hunters who killed dozens of ordinary wolves, but the attacks continued. In 1765, a local hunter named Jean Chastel shot a wolf described as unusually large, with a coat of reddish fur and an abnormal number of teeth. The attack stopped. The specimen was stuffed and presented to the royal court, where it was displayed until it decayed beyond recognition. Modern analysis of the surviving description suggests the animal may have been a hybrid between a wolf and a large domestic dog, or possibly a striped hyena escaped from a private menagerie, but the definitive identification was lost when the specimen decomposed. But that is too neat. The real reason the werewolf terrified the medieval peasant more than any ordinary wolf was not biological. It was symbolic. The wolf was the predator that lived just beyond the firelight, the thing that took children who wandered into the forest, the animal that consumed the grandmother and left only a bloody shift for the granddaughter to find. But the werewolf was worse because it was the wolf that walked on 2 legs. It was the neighbor who smiled at you in church and tore the sheep apart in the field. It was the hunter who returned from the forest with blood under his nails and claimed it was from a deer. In a world where survival depended on the trust of your community, the werewolf was the embodiment of the suspicion that someone among you was not what they seemed. Now confront the unsettling truth that this pattern has not disappeared. The psychological machinery that produced the werewolf still operates in the modern mind, but the content has changed. The modern version is not a wolf. It is the serial killer who lived next door for 20 years, the quiet neighbor who nobody suspected, the coworker who smiled while planning atrocities. The same horror of the hidden predator, the same betrayal of trust, the same impossible contradiction between the human face and the animal act. The werewolf was never really about wolves. It was about the fear that the boundary between the human and the animal is thinner than we want to believe, that it can be crossed without warning, and that we might not recognize the crossing in ourselves. If you have ever found yourself staring at a stranger in a crowd and feeling a chill that you could not explain, you have touched the same nerve that the medieval peasant felt in the wolfwood. It is the ancient recognition that the face of the monster can wear a human smile, that the beast can be your brother, your father, yourself. The biologist would tell you that the feeling is a residual adaptation, a survival mechanism that evolved in a world where the predator was real and silence meant death. The neurologist would explain that the amygdala processes the face of a human and the body of a wolf using separate circuits, and that the werewolf myth triggers a conflict between those circuits that produces a unique form of dread. Both are correct, but neither explains why the feeling persists long after the wolves have been hunted to near extinction. That persistence is the real mystery. We are nearing the edge of this investigation, but the next chapter will take us deeper into the brain itself, into the neural circuits that keep the werewolf alive inside us. Do not let the thread drop. Subscribe so you are here when we descend. And in the comments, answer honestly. When you felt that chill while reading this, what exactly were you afraid of? Was it the predator or the recognition? The truth is that the werewolf never left. It changed form. It lives in the collective nightmare of a world where the boundary between human and animal has become a political question, where the animal within is pathologized and medicated, where the primal rage that once drove the wolf to hunt is expressed instead in road rage, domestic violence, and the slow erosion of patience that characterizes modern life. The peasants feared the wolf because the wolf was real. We fear the werewolf because we suspect, somewhere in the core of our consciousness, that the wolf is us. This is just the surface. In the next chapter, we will descend into the neurological architecture that produces the werewolf sensation, the specific brain regions that dissolve the boundary between self and animal, the hallucinogens that were used in shamanic rituals to trigger the transformation, and the archaeological evidence that suggests the werewolf myth predates writing by at least 30,000 years. But for now, sit with this question. When you felt the chill of the wolf wood while reading this, what exactly were you afraid of? Was it the memory of a predator that no longer threatens you? Or was it the recognition that the shape of the beast still fits something inside you? Drop your answer below. Tell me which part of this unsettled you the most.